Welcome to Stab the Dragon Productions for episode number 194 and book review number 18, possibly. Today we'll examine Beam Straight Up, the bold story of the first family of bourbon by Fred Noe, 7th generation Beam Master Distiller. And the correct pronunciation of his name is No, not Noe. It's Fred No. This book is 206 pages and cost me $14.79 on Amazon in September of 2024. I read this book over November, December of 2024. Its genre is it's history, it's autobiography, but I'm going to also say it's business studies and a cocktail recipe book, and specifically whiskey studies. There you go. Now this was a fun read. Well, I've got a bottle of Jim Beam rye here, so as long as I'm talking about Jim Beam, I might as well have some. This is the 80 proof version of Jim Beam rye, and it's pretty good. I prefer the 90 proof version, the Prohibition rye, but I think they're phasing that one out for some ridiculous reason, and this one is going to be soon the only one available. All right, this book was a fun read that gave me some insider information on the history of whiskey in America, the Beam family enterprise in particular. But it's really only designed for a niche audience that I will call whiskey nerds, of which species I am one. It's written in a folksy, colloquial style and is certainly not an objective academic history of bourbon, but does qualify as a primary source if someone is interested in writing a paper on bourbon. College students, take note. There is a lot of personal information about the Beam family here, and of Fred No specifically. So if you are a big Jim Beam bourbon fan, that is, you like Jim Beam bourbon, Knob Creek, they make Knob Creek, Old Tub, Old Granddad, Booker's, Baker's, and Basil Hayden, you might enjoy this book. If you are in the liquor business, you could profit by reading this book, I believe. And if you're an American history student and like bourbon, although you better be over 21, this inside look at the bourbon industry is fascinating and a historical thing there with the history of Jim Beam, history of bourbon, history of Kentucky. My reasons for reading this book include a hope to conduct a Jim Beam product whiskey tasting for some folks later this year, but I don't know if that's going to happen or not. But I did want the background information just in case. And on this channel, I do whiskey reviews as well as book reviews, so it seems fitting. And the Jim Beam rye is decent, pretty good. The book could have used a bit more history from the early years, and the big obvious flaw in the book is that the publication of this book 2 years prior to the takeover by the Japanese firm Suntory in 2014 is just a little too convenient. I don't know. It could have also profited, I think, from just a little bit more number crunching charts to track sales, compare with the competition. I like graphs and charts and stuff, and I think that would have, the visual presentation of that information would have helped me. Let's look at some of the details and the stories that Fred No tells us in his book. In 1790, Jacob Jacob Beam, a descendant of German immigrants, probably born in Pennsylvania, the evidence there is pretty good, moved to Kentucky to a farm, and in those days farming also meant distilling whiskey from the grain crops because that preserved your grain. It was easily storable and highly marketable. The economy back then was still largely a barter economy. I mean, there was some specie, there was some money involved, but barter economy. So trading barrels of whiskey for other goods and services was common on the frontier. Jacob Beam developed his recipe for bourbon, and it was called Old Jake Beam Sour Mash. And it's the recipe for Jim Beam bourbon still today. So Fred No says. And then Jacob Beam started selling it on the market in 1795. His son David Beam soon took over the business, and then his son, or the grandson of Jacob, David M. Beam, and by this time they have Americanized the spelling. Okay, it went from Boehm to Beam at some point in that history, that early history. His son David soon took over the business, and grandson David M. Beam took over in 1853 and began using a column still. See, all these pioneers, they came from Scotland and Ireland, they came from Germany, and they were used to a copper pot still. And so that's what most liquor was distilled with back in those days. But now, by the middle of the 19th century, this column still is coming into play, and so David M. Beam begins utilizing that column still and founded a new distillery by the railhead in Nelson County, Kentucky. Named his whiskey Old Tub. So when you see Old Tub in the liquor stores today, that's a hearkening back to this original Old Tub. Now, David M. Beam's son was the Jim Beam, fourth generation, the great-grandson of Jacob and the great-grandfather of Fred No. Jim Beam and Old Tub bourbon grew and grew and grew some more. And then Prohibition hit. The Volstead Act went into effect in January of 1920, and Jim Beam sold his distillery, locked up the rack houses, and bought into a rock quarry to support his family. Cheers. Jim Beam purchased also, right beside the rock quarry, mind you, an old abandoned distillery. And he was, going to operate it when and if the Volstead Act got overturned. But now Jim Beam still owned lots of barrels of aging bourbon in those rack houses. I mean, Prohibition, during those Prohibition years, several of those barrels, a lot of those barrels, many barrels, disappeared from the rack houses. Were they stolen? Did Jim Beam maybe sell some on the side, to get a little cash going? Who knows? But Prohibition made criminals out of a lot of people. But finally, 1933, the 21st Amendment overturned the 18th Amendment, and I think I'm getting that right. And then they were allowed to distill again, right? But here's the deal about making bourbon. It takes years, because why? You have to age it, right? You have to get financing. You got to set up. You got to contract for the grain and hire workers. And I mean, they had to start from scratch almost. And during Prohibition, the Canadians and the Scotch and Irish, they did not stop production, nor did they stop selling. You had rum runners, fast boats off the Atlantic and across the Great Lakes. Now, we have previously studied Sam Bronfman and his work with in Canada, where he bought into what's the name of the company he bought into? Seagram's. That's what. Bronfman bought into Seagram's and started running it, and so he was running liquor across the Great Lakes and across the border. So the net result is when Prohibition ended in America, it took Jim Beam a long time to ramp up production, age his whiskey, and all the while Canadian whiskey, Scotch, Irish whiskey was pouring into the country. And so Americans were drinking Canadian whiskey. Uh, they were drinking VO. They were, started drinking uh, Cutty Sark. So that's what was going on. So finally, Jim Beam got production. He got the money needed. But the first bourbons that were released were kind of released too early, and they were poor quality. Some guys blended their bourbons with vodka. Uh, the American bourbon industry, once strong, was now weak, sickly, and a little sister to Canadian whiskey or Scotch or Irish. So to get going again, it took a lot more than just hard work for the Beam family. They had to get loans from the bank eventually. They had to sell off a portion of their interest in the distillery. And then a few years later, they sold the remainder. So the Beam family stayed on working for the company, but Prohibition basically wrecked them financially. And so they lost ultimate control over their company, even though they were running it, and they were providing the master distillers through each generation. So by the 1950s, the bourbon had been renamed Colonel James B. Beam Bourbon, and it was marketed all over the country. And so, Jim Beam passed away. I think it was 1947, maybe, and his brother took over. Jeremiah Beam, or Jerry is what they called him. And so they began heavily marketing their new bourbon, Colonel James B. Beam Bourbon, all over the country, and grew the brand from scratch. Now, Fred Noe is the grandson of Jim Beam's daughter, Margaret, and he is the son of Booker Noe, or Booker Noe. I keep wanting to say Noe because it's got that E on the end. Booker Noe. Does that name Booker sound familiar? And Fred has a cousin named Baker. Does that name ring a bell with Jim Beam products? So now you're seeing where some of the names of Beam products come from. Fred Noe tells the story of how his dad was experimenting with bourbon and produced what came to be known as Booker's, which was high proof, cask strength. And he also tells the story, and I found this fascinating. When Fred was about like 13 years old and doing odd things in the distillery here and there, just being with his dad, one of the employees, his dad wanted some empty barrels to use as planters or something. And so this employee, he gave 13-year-old Booker, or 13-year-old Fred, the keys to the truck and said, hey, go down to the distillery and pick up some barrels. So 13-year-old driving the truck to pick up barrels. And the employee who was giving him the barrels said, hey, there's still bourbon in those barrels. And he looked and he said, no, they're empty. He said, no, it's in the wood. And he remembered that. And years later, when he was now an employee of the distillery and actually fairly high up, they were talking about different products they could bring about, and he remembered that conversation. And so Fred Noe said, hey, there's bourbon in those empty barrels that we could extract, because the employee who had told him how to do it. And everybody looked at him kind of surprised. Says, no, we can do this. And so they experimented with it, and lo and behold, Jim Beam Devil's Cut was born from that conversation. Devil's Cut, that's where they squeeze the bourbon out of the wood that's there inside the barrel, and use water to extract it, and probably temperature control too. So anyway, Jim Beam Devil's Cut was born that way. So throughout the book, there are sidebars, boxed off stories, or facts that explain the industry some. And one sidebar discusses all the different brands around the world that Jim Beam owns. Lafroig Scotch. There you go. Canadian club owned by Jim Beam. Connemara, Irish. Just a few examples there. Another sidebar lists the countries that import the most Jim Beam. Australia heads that list. New Zealand, Germany, the UK, Hungary, Canada, the Czech Republic, and Japan. And now Japan owns Jim Beam. Go figure. The book is useful in a broader sense, I think, for businessmen and those studying business. Fred No takes us down several paths of how Jim Beam Company made decisions, how they innovated, how they led the way in things like small batch bourbons that his dad, Booker No, started, flavored whiskeys like Red Stag. And Fred says he was against the whole concept of flavored whiskeys. And you know, they went ahead with it despite his objections, and they called him in and gave him some Red Stag, and he started sipping it and realized this is a good thing. Well, I've had Red Stag, and it's not for me. Now, maybe mixed with something, but the flavored whiskeys that I've tried have been just too sweet, just really sweet. So I've pretty much got to mix those with something. But Fred shows us throughout the book the ups and downs of the bourbon business that fascinated a non-business guy like me. So I just found the book fascinating, wonderful. My final evaluation. This is a very fun, informative book, but again, it's really meant for whiskey nerds and those inside the industry. So, you know, maybe if you're a good fan of Jim Beam whiskeys, maybe this book would be for you. If you're a history nerd like I am and you like whiskey, then here you go. This book is great. I think liquor stores and bars need a book section. They need one of those, you know, things that go around in circles and you have books on it. I'm just saying. You can see my, you know, whiskey book collection there. So I am glad that I read the book. And if you're part of a whiskey group that gets together and shares whiskeys regularly, I would consider bringing this book up for a group reading project. I mean, it's inexpensive. It's a quick read. Let me just read the prologue real quick here that he wrote. Or I'll read part of it here. Now, there have been books written about bourbon before. They've even been books written about my family and the company that they built, Beam Inc. So rather than go over subjects that have been covered, I thought I'd offer a little bit of everything. The history of the Jim Beam family and my memories of growing up in it, the history of bourbon and how it's made, and the things I've learned from being the master distiller and ambassador of one of the world's most recognizable brands, Jim Beam Bourbon. And just in case you're thinking of starting your own business, I added my views, thoughts, and recommendations, free of charge, on how to build a brand in a company for the long haul. And I would say 7 generations, that's a long haul. I think I have a little insight into that considering we're more than 200 years old. I guess in the end, this book is part entertainment, part educational, and maybe, just maybe, a little inspirational. So sit back and pour yourself a drink. I had a big time writing this thing. Hopefully you'll have just as big a time reading it. Well, again, I recommend the book. So this is StabtheDragon Productions, out here.